Eli had always been told that the Valkyrie were cold, or an ancient race, one of the most powerful in the galaxy, and they didn't care much for other species. Humans were often seen as weak by the Valkyrie, who viewed emotion as a sign of weakness. But Eli wasn't afraid. He was a soldier, part of the peacekeeping mission sent to negotiate with them. His job was simple: stay professional, be polite, and do whatever it took to keep the peace. When the call came that they were assigned to work with the Valkyrie, Eli felt a strange mixture of nerves and excitement. He'd heard stories about their commander, Alira, and how she had a reputation for being distant and calculating. She never showed emotions, and that made her all the more feared. Eli knew he would have to deal with her directly during the mission, but he was ready. After all, he had faced worse than the coldness of an alien commander. His team arrived at the Valkyrie flagship, a massive, sleek ship that floated silently in the cold depths of space. The ship's walls were made of a dark, metallic substance that gleamed in the dim lights. Everything was orderly and precise. There was no sign of warmth anywhere. The crew moved in perfect synchronization, all focused on their duties. It was clear that the Valkyrie valued efficiency over everything else. Eli was escorted to the briefing room where he would meet Alira as he walked through the long corridors. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The Valkyrie soldiers, with their cold eyes, seemed to study him as he passed, but they never spoke. It was as though he was invisible to them, nothing more than a part of the scenery. Finally, they reached the room. The doors opened, and Eli was greeted by a tall, imposing figure. Alira stood at the head of the room, her uniform dark and perfectly tailored. Her posture was straight, and her face was set in a firm expression. She looked like she was made of stone. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned Eli as he entered. "You're late," she said in a voice that was calm but firm. Eli stood up straight. "I apologize, Commander. We had a slight delay with the transport." She nodded, but there was no warmth in the gesture. She wasn't interested in excuses. Eli sat at the table, trying not to let the silence between them grow too awkward. He had heard that the Valkyrie didn't waste time on pleasantries, so he kept his mouth shut. Alira began the briefing, her voice steady and cold as she outlined the terms of their mission. There was no emotion in her words, only pure business. Eli couldn't help but study her as she spoke. She was everything he had expected: a leader who gave orders without hesitation, who didn't let anything distract her. Her face was smooth, with sharp features and high cheekbones, her skin a pale silver that almost seemed to shimmer in the light. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her eyes were a striking shade of violet. She looked every bit the part of a commander, powerful and unyielding. As the briefing continued, Eli tried to focus on the mission, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Alira. There was something about her that intrigued him. Despite her cold exterior, he felt a strange pull toward her. It was as if she was more than just the stoic commander she appeared to be. There had to be more to her, something deeper hidden beneath the surface. After the meeting, Eli was assigned to work directly with Alira for the next phase of the mission. He was to help coordinate between the Valkyrie and the human peacekeepers, ensuring that both sides were prepared for the upcoming peace talks. He had expected her to be distant, and she didn't disappoint. She gave him orders, and he followed them without question. But every now and then, when their eyes met, he caught a glimpse of something he couldn't quite place. Was it regret? Sadness? He couldn't tell. It was only there for a second, and then it was gone, replaced by the same cold, impassive expression she always wore. Days passed, and Eli continued to work alongside Alira. The Valkyrie were efficient, but they were also secretive. Every now and then, Eli would catch Alira looking at him as if she was studying him, trying to figure him out. But whenever he tried to engage her in conversation, she kept her responses short and to the point. Didn't seem interested in getting to know him. It was clear that she had a job to do, and she wasn't going to let anything or anyone get in her way. Still, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to her. He had dealt with many commanders before, but none like her. Alira was different. She was more than just a leader. There was a fire inside of her, something he could sense beneath her cold facade. But she didn't let anyone see it. One evening after a long day of meetings, Eli found himself in the mess hall, sitting alone at a table. He wasn't hungry, but he needed time to think. The mission was going well, but the tension between the two species was still palpable. He knew that the peace talks would be difficult. But more than that, he couldn't get Alira out of his mind. He wanted to understand her, to know what made her tick. He wanted to see the woman behind the commander. Just as he was about to get up and leave, he saw Alira walk into the mess hall. She didn't notice him at first, her focus on something in the distance. For a moment she seemed different, vulnerable, perhaps even lost. But then, just as quickly, she snapped back to her usual controlled self. Her gaze shifted toward him, and she walked over, her footsteps echoing in the quiet room. "You," she said, her voice flat. "I need you for the next phase of the mission. Meet me in the briefing room in 15 minutes." Eli nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He watched her leave, her cold, controlled demeanor in place once again. But in that brief moment, he had seen something human. The next morning, Eli woke up early. The day ahead was important, and he needed to be ready. The peace talks were about to begin, and things were tense. The Valkyrie had made it clear that they were not interested in making friends with humans. They had their own plans and goals, and the alliance was something they were only willing to consider for practical reasons. Eli, however, couldn't ignore the feeling that something important was at stake, not just for the galaxy, but for him personally. He arrived in the briefing room, where Alira was already waiting. She stood at the head of the table, staring at a holographic display that showed maps and data of the regions they would be discussing. As usual, her posture was perfect, her expression hard and unreadable. She had a way of commanding attention, even when she wasn't speaking. "Good morning, Commander," Eli said as he entered the room. Alira glanced at him briefly but said nothing. She only nodded and motioned for him to sit. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore, but it was still thick. Eli had learned that this was the way Alira operated, focused, serious, and to the point. She didn't waste time on small talk. The sooner they got down to business, the sooner she could continue with the mission. Eli sat and opened his datapad. Preparing for the meeting? The discussions were going to be difficult. The Valkyrie wanted certain assurances from the human side, and the humans had their own list of demands. But it wasn't just the talks themselves that weighed heavily on Eli's mind. It was his growing curiosity about Alira, despite the cold exterior she presented. There was something about her that made Eli want to understand her. He had always been good at reading people, and he could tell that Alira wasn't just a leader. With no feelings, there was more beneath the surface. But every time he tried to get closer, she pushed him away with her ice-cold demeanor. As the talks began, Eli focused on the task at hand. They needed to bridge the gap between the two sides. Even if it seemed impossible, Alira took the lead, as expected. She was sharp, clear, and unflinching as she made demands and explained the Valkyrie's position. She didn't hesitate to call out any flaws in the human representative's arguments. Eli found himself impressed by her, despite the tension. In the middle of the meeting, the holographic display flickered, showing an incoming message. Alira paused, then raised a hand to stop the discussion. The room went silent as she activated the message. It was from a Valkyrie fleet near the edge of the galaxy, reporting a sudden attack by an unknown force. Alira's eyes narrowed. She quickly scanned the message before turning back to the room. "It seems we have a new problem. The peace talks will need to be postponed." The humans in the room exchanged uneasy glances, but no one argued. It was clear that Alira was already making decisions. She wasted no time. "Eli, come with me. We're going to the war room." Eli stood, nodding in agreement. He followed Alira down the long corridors of the ship. The atmosphere was different, now charged with urgency. Alira's usual icy calm was replaced with sharp focus, her every step measured and quick. As they reached the war room, Eli couldn't help but notice how commanding she was, even in the face of a sudden crisis. She didn't show fear or doubt. She was a leader in the truest sense of the word, Inside the war room, a team of Valkyrie soldiers were already working to assess the situation. Their communications officer was busy updating the map with information on the unknown fleet's movements. Alira stepped up to the map, her eyes scanning the data. "Prepare the fleet. We'll handle this ourselves." Eli watched as the crew began. Working faster, everyone in sync with one another. There was a sense of quiet respect in the room. No one questioned Alira's orders. She commanded them effortlessly, and they followed without hesitation. "Do you need me to assist in any way?" "Commander?" Eli asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. Alira glanced at him, her eyes cool and calculating. "Stay out of the way, human. This is Valkyrie business." Eli felt a twinge of frustration, but kept his face neutral. He had no choice but to comply. He watched as Alira continued to give orders, her voice steady as she communicated with her fleet. The situation was serious, and the calmness she displayed seemed to make the whole room feel more organized. She was a force to be reckoned with, and it was clear that this was her element. As the war room filled with activity, Eli couldn't help but admire her. There was no hesitation in her decisions. She had the entire situation under control, and everyone in the room knew it. Alira didn't need to show emotion to lead. Her actions spoke louder than any words ever could. Alira looked over at Eli, noticing him standing off to the side. "You can help by staying alert. If you want to make yourself useful, keep an eye on the human fleet's status." Eli nodded and quickly moved to a nearby console, watching the status reports on the human fleet as they came in. The tension in the room was palpable, but no one spoke. Everyone knew their role. Alira continued to command with ease, making decisions as the situation developed. She was focused, efficient, and completely unflappable. The next few hours were a blur of activity. The unknown fleet was approaching fast, and the Valkyrie forces had to be ready. Alira and Eli exchanged only a few words during the process, but Eli could feel the energy in the room shifting. The humans and the Valkyrie were working together, albeit under the pressure of an imminent threat. Eli realized that this might be the first time he had seen the Valkyrie truly respect the human side of the alliance. As the preparations continued, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing between him and Alira. He had always thought of her as a cold, distant commander, but now, seeing her in action, he began to understand her more. Her coldness wasn't about dislike or disdain, it was a result of years of responsibility. Of having to make tough decisions in a galaxy that showed no mercy. They were ready. Lyra looked at Eli one last time before they went to the command deck. "Stay close and do your job. This is far from over."
Out.
Eli followed her, his mind racing. What had started as a simple diplomatic mission had quickly turned into something much more complicated. When somewhere deep inside, Eli realized that he wasn't just intrigued by Alira's strength, he was beginning to admire her. The situation was becoming more intense by the hour. The unknown fleet had advanced closer, and the Valkyrie forces were preparing for battle. Eli had never experienced such a high-stakes situation before. As a soldier, he had been through plenty of training, but nothing could have prepared him for the feeling of being in a war room with alien forces so close to an enemy that was completely unknown. Alira's presence in the room was as commanding as ever. She paced back and forth in front of the map, her eyes focused and calculating. She spoke with her officers, giving orders in short, clipped sentences. The atmosphere was thick with tension. No one dared to speak out of turn. Eli tried to stay out of the way, as Alira had instructed, but it was hard not to be drawn into the energy of the room. The intensity of the situation was contagious, and he couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. The fate of the peace talks, and possibly even the future of the human and Valkyrie alliance, rested on their ability to defeat this unknown enemy. The minutes ticked by like hours, and Eli couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just another mission. Something about the way Alira held herself, so calm and composed in the face of danger, made him realize how much she was willing to risk. For her people, yes, but also for the galaxy. Eli had seen leaders in action before, but none like her. She wasn't just leading. She was fighting for something greater. Her cold exterior made sense. Now it wasn't about being distant. It was about survival. The alarm suddenly blared, and Eli's heart jumped. The unknown fleet had arrived. Elira's voice rang out, steady and authoritative. All ships prepare for battle. Human fleet, align with Valkyrie positions. Eli, stay close. Eli moved quickly, joining the human officers who had gathered at a secondary console. He glanced over at Elira, who was already coordinating with the fleet's command officers. The look on her face was serious, and he could see that there was no room for mistakes. This battle wasn't just about strategy, it was about trust. As the first rounds of fire exchanged between the two fleets, the room filled with the noise of weapon systems coming to life. Eli's job was to ensure the human fleet stayed coordinated with the Valkyrie. But he found himself distracted by Elira. Every time he looked at her, he saw the weight of leadership in her eyes. It wasn't just about the fight, it was about making sure her people survived. During a brief pause in the fighting, when the fleets temporarily withdrew to regroup, Elira stepped away from the control panel. Her face, usually so emotionless, showed a brief flicker of something different. A slight tightening of her jaw, a flash of fatigue in her eyes. It was small, but it was enough for Eli to notice. He hesitated before walking toward her. "Commander, are you okay?" Elira didn't look at him immediately. She was watching the tactical readouts on the screen, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the console. For a moment, Eli thought she might ignore him, as she always did. But then she spoke, her voice low and almost tired. "I've been leading my people for a long time, Eli. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing." The vulnerability in her words surprised Eli. He had never imagined that Elira, the cold, distant commander, could have doubts. He took a careful step closer, but still kept a respectful distance. "You're doing what you think is best for your people," Eli said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm sure of that." Elira finally turned her eyes to him, her gaze still sharp but softer than it had been before. There was no anger or disdain in her expression, only exhaustion. "It's more than that," she said quietly. "I'm doing what I think is best for everyone, for the galaxy." Eli nodded. He didn't fully understand the weight she was carrying, but he knew she wasn't just a leader. She was a protector, a warrior, fighting for more than just victory. It wasn't just about the battle or the mission. It was about something deeper. Something bigger than both of them. Elira turned back to the console, the moment gone. "We need to prepare for the next phase. If we don't stop them now, it's over." Eli stepped back, feeling a mix of respect and something else he couldn't quite place. He'd always thought of her as cold, a leader who never showed weakness. But now he saw her as more than just a commander. He saw the person behind the mask. The battle continued, the unknown fleet showing no sign of backing down. The Valkyrie and human forces fought side by side, coordinating flawlessly under Elira's guidance. Eli did his part, keeping the human fleet in line as they moved through the chaos of battle. He couldn't deny the bond he was beginning to feel with the Valkyrie. Despite their differences, they were working together, human and alien, fighting for a common cause. Hours passed in a blur of strategy and explosions, but eventually, the tides of battle began to turn. The unknown fleet, though powerful, started to retreat. Elira's tactics had worked, and the combined strength of the Valkyrie and human forces proved too much for the enemy to handle. With a final surge of fire, enemy ships began to scatter, their attack broken. Elira's fleet had won. Eli watched as the lights in the war room shifted, the tension in the air slowly easing. The immediate danger had passed, but there was no celebration, no cheers. The room was silent, save for the hum of the systems and the soft sound of Elira's breathing. She turned to face the room, her expression returning to its usual cold, focused state. "This battle is won, but the war isn't over. We move forward." Eli couldn't help but notice the slight shake of her hand as she gave the order. The weight of her responsibility was immense, but she didn't let it show. She was still the leader, still the commander. And yet Eli knew she was human too. She carried the burden of leadership in ways no one else would understand. As the war room slowly emptied, Eli stayed behind, watching Elira from a distance. He knew this was far from the end. The peace talks were still on the horizon, and their work together wasn't done. but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them. They'd shared a moment, a rare glimpse into who Alira really was. Eli didn't know what would come next, but he was ready. The Alliance. And their future depended on it. The victory over the unknown fleet was a relief, but it didn't bring peace. The battle had been hard, and the aftermath was filled with tension. Both the Valkyrie and the human forces were now preparing for the next step in their alliance. Alira, however, had no time for celebration. Her mind was already focused on the next challenge. Eli, exhausted from the battle, returned to his quarters. He knew the mission wasn't over. The threat was still out there and the peace talks had to happen soon. But the victory had given him a glimpse into Alira's true nature. She wasn't just a cold commander. There was more to her than what he had first seen, and that made him wonder about his own feelings toward her. The next day, Eli was summoned back to the war room. The atmosphere was tense as usual, but this time, there was something different in the air. Alira's sharp gaze was fixed on the data displayed on the screen. The reports were not about the battle they had just fought, were about something far more concerning, Alira said, her voice as steady as ever. We have a problem. Eli moved closer to the screen, scanning the information. It seemed that the victory against the unknown fleet had uncovered something troubling. There was a new threat, but it wasn't from the enemy. They had already been pushed back. The problem was from within their own ranks. A traitor had been found. Someone inside the Valkyrie military was working against them, leaking vital information. To the enemy, Alira's expression was colder than ever as she processed the information. The betrayal ran deep, and it was clear that someone had been working in the shadows, playing both sides. This traitor, Alira continued, her voice low but dangerous, must be dealt with swiftly. We cannot afford any more surprises, Eli felt. A chill run down his spine. Betrayal in the middle of a war was one thing, but a betrayal from within their own alliance was a danger that could destroy everything they had worked for. Who is it? Eli asked, his voice tight with concern. Alira didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned to her officers and began giving orders. It was clear that this was not a conversation for everyone. The room emptied quickly, and soon it was just Eli and Alira standing alone. The traitor is one of my own, Alira said quietly. I have a feeling it's someone close to me, but I don't know who yet. Eli watched her closely, noting the rare vulnerability in her eyes. It was fleeting, but it was there. Alira, the cold commander, was struggling with this betrayal. Had always carried the weight of leadership alone, but now she was being forced to confront a weakness she couldn't control. I'll help you, Eli said, stepping forward. We need to find this person before they do any more damage. Alira met his gaze, her eyes searching his face for a moment. Then, with a slight nod, she agreed. You're right. We need to act fast. Investigation into the traitor began immediately. Eli was pulled into the process, helping Alira sift through data, tracking down leads, and questioning anyone who might be involved. The pressure of the situation weighed heavily on them both. Each day, the evidence grew more troubling, and the sense of urgency became overwhelming as they dug deeper. Lara began to open up more to Eli. She confided in him about the challenges of being a commander, how the burden of leadership had always been hers to bear alone. She admitted that her distance, her coldness, was a shield, a way to protect herself from the pain of losing her people. But now, with the traitor threatening everything, that shield was starting to crack. I don't know who I can trust anymore, Alira said one evening, her voice barely above a whisper. I've led my people for so long, and now this. I don't know if I can do it alone anymore. Eli watched her, feeling a strange mix of empathy and admiration. He had never seen her like this, vulnerable, unsure, and raw. For the first time, he saw the person behind the commander. He understood now that her coldness wasn't a sign of her lack of carrot, was a defense against the weight of responsibility she carried. You don't have to do it alone, Eli said softly. You don't have to hide your feelings behind that mask. We can figure this out together. Alira looked at him, her gaze intense but grateful. For a moment she seemed to hesitate, as if considering something important. Then, as if making a decision, she nodded. I trust you, Eli. That was all she said, but the meaning was clear. She trusted him with more than just the mission. She trusted him with her vulnerability, with her burden. And in that moment, Eli realized that their connection was deeper than he had thought. They weren't just allies anymore, they were partners. Bound by the same mission and the same goal, the search for the traitor continued. But with each new lead, they found themselves growing closer. Alira allowed herself to lean on Eli more and more. She sought his advice, trusted his judgment, and relied on him to help make the tough decisions. Finally, after days of investigation, they had a breakthrough. A senior officer in Alira's fleet had been in contact with the enemy, feeding them information about Valkyrie movements and strategies. The betrayal was a shock, but not entirely unexpected. The officer had always been ambitious, but Alira had never suspected that ambition would drive him to sell out his own people. The traitor was arrested. The crew was informed of the betrayal. The Valkyrie were shaken, but they knew what needed to be done. Alira's leadership had once again been tested, and she had passed, but it wasn't without its cost. She had trusted someone she shouldn't have, and that mistake had nearly cost them everything. As the situation calmed, Alira and Eli stood together, looking out at the stars. The peace talks were still on the horizon, but now they were stronger than ever. The alliance between humans and the Valkyrie had been tested, but it had survived. And as they prepared to face whatever came next, Eli knew that whatever the future held, he would face it by Alira's side. The days that followed the traitor's arrest were tense, but a sense of calm had settled over the Valkyrie ship. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but the consequences of betrayal lingered in the air. Alira, though still focused on the mission, couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The weight of leadership had become heavier. With it came the realization that trust was something she could no longer take for granted. Eli noticed the change in her too. She had always been focused, always had a plan. But now there was a weariness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. He could see that she was struggling, and he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of sympathy. Alira had always carried the burden of command alone, but now, with everything that had happened, he wondered if she was beginning to realize that she didn't have to do it alone anymore. One evening, as the crew prepared for the final phase of the mission, Eli found himself in the command room once again. Alira was there, her back to him, as she studied the holographic map that displayed the paths of the enemy forces. Her eyes were sharp, but there was a slight tremor in her hands that betrayed her calm exterior. It was subtle, but Eli noticed. You're not alone in this, Alira, Eli said quietly, standing beside her. She didn't look up at him right away, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. Finally, she turned her head and met his gaze. There was a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes before she masked it again with her usual cold composure. I know, she said softly, but the responsibility is mine, Eli. I cannot afford to be weak. Not now. Eli's heart ached at her words. He understood the weight she was carrying, but he also understood that she didn't have to carry it alone. He'd seen her in action, commanding her people with strength and precision. But he had also seen the person beneath the commander, the one who was capable of feeling the same fears and doubts as anyone else. You don't have to be perfect, Eli said. You don't have to do it all alone. We're in this together. The Valkyrie, the humans, we all need each other. For a moment, Alira was silent. She looked down at the map again, her face unreadable. But then she nodded. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. She was starting to accept that she wasn't alone. She didn't have to carry the weight of the galaxy on her shoulders by herself. The final phase of the mission was the most dangerous. The enemy forces had regrouped, and this time, they weren't going to back down. Alira had made the decision. To confront them head-on, the battle would take place in the heart of the galaxy, where both fleets would clash in a fight for control. As the Valkyrie and human fleets prepared for battle, Eli stood by Alira's side on the command deck. The tension was thick in the air. The sounds of the ship's engines humming, the buzz of communication systems, and the rush of adrenaline were all around them. Eli felt his heart race, but he remained focused. This was at the moment that would decide everything. All units are in position, Alira said, her voice steady but low. "Prepare to engage." Eli nodded, his hands gripping the railing in front of him. He had never been in a battle like this before. The stakes were higher than ever, and the outcome of this fight could change the course of history. But despite the danger, he knew one thing for certain: he would face it with Alira. Just as she had stood by his side, the battle began with a deafening roar as both fleets collided. Eli could hear the sounds of weapons fire through the cums, and the flashes of energy from the enemy ships lit up the vastness of space.
Valkyrie.
And human forces fought together as one, coordinated under Alira's command. It was clear that they had become a true team, no longer divided by species, but united by a common cause. Alira's orders came swiftly, cutting through the chaos of the battle. She was everywhere, her mind calculating each move, her eyes never leaving the battlefield. Eli could see the strength in her, the way she controlled the flow of the fight. But he also saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the toll that leading this mission had taken on her, despite the cold, calculating exterior. Eli knew that Alira cared deeply about the people she led. She had done everything to protect them, to ensure their survival. And now, as they fought side by side, Eli could see that she was beginning to trust in the people around her as the battle raged on. Alira's voice remained calm, issuing orders. With precision, Eli, following her lead, coordinated the human fleet with expert timing. They moved together, anticipating each other's actions with the kind of trust that only comes from true partnership. The enemy was powerful, but the combined strength of the Valkyrie and human forces was even greater. Minutes turned to hours as the battle continued, but the tide was slowly turning in their favor. The enemy forces began to retreat, their ships scattering into the darkness of space. Victory was within reach, but Alira's focus never wavered. She was still watching the battlefield, still making decisions, still leading. When the last of the enemy ships vanished, the war room fell silent. The crew had won, but there was no time for celebration. The battle was over, but the war was far from finished. Alira stood at the center of the room, her face grim, her mind already shifting to the next phase of the mission. Eli approached her, his heart still racing from the battle. He had been through many fights, but nothing had ever felt like this. They had fought for each other, not as separate species, but as a united force. And in that moment, Eli realized that Alira had led them to victory, not just as a commander, but as someone who had learned to trust those around her. "You did it," Eli said, his voice steady but filled with admiration. Alira turned to face him, her expression unreadable. But there was something in her eyes, something that spoke of both relief and exhaustion. "We did it," she corrected him, her voice quiet. For the first time since their mission began. Eli saw a small, genuine smile cross Alira's face. It was brief, but it was enough. She had led her people to victory, and in doing so, she had learned something she hadn't been willing to accept before. She wasn't alone. As they stood together on the command deck, watching the stars outside, Eli felt a sense of hope. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, he believed that anything was possible. Together, they could face whatever came next. The victory had been hard-earned, and the battle had left its mark on everyone involved. The alliance between the humans and the Valkyrie had been tested, but it had held strong as the dust settled and the last remnants of the battle faded away. Alira stood on the command deck, her eyes fixed on the stars outside. It was over for now. The mission wasn't complete yet. There was still so much left to do. Eli walked up to her, his boots clicking softly on the metal floor. He had grown used to the tension between them, but something had changed in the last few days. Alira wasn't the same cold commander he had first met. She had allowed him to get closer, allowed herself to trust him in ways she hadn't before. And in return, Eli had begun to see her not just as a leader, but as a person, someone who carried a heavy burden and was learning to share it. "We did it," Lee said, his voice steady as he approached her. Alira didn't turn to face him immediately. She was still staring out at the stars, lost in thought. For a moment, the silence between them felt natural, comfortable. It wasn't the cold distance that had defined their relationship before. It was something else, a quiet understanding that had grown between them, yes. Alira replied quietly. "We did." She finally turned to face him, and for the first time, Eli saw something in her eyes that wasn't cold or distant. It was a flicker of warmth, a small spark of something. Real, it was fleeting, but it was there. "We've come a long way," Alira continued. "From strangers, to allies, to partners." Her gaze softened slightly. "I never expected to find someone like you." Eli wasn't sure how to respond. He'd always known that this mission would be challenging, but he had never expected. It did change him the way it had. He had always been focused on the task at hand, but over time, he had grown to care about Alira and the people she led. They had fought side by side, and in doing so, they had forged a bond that was stronger than either of them had anticipated. "You've led your people through the toughest challenges," Eli said, his voice sincere, "and you've done it without losing yourself in the process." Alira's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I've had help. I didn't do this alone." She paused, her expression thoughtful. "I've learned that I don't have to carry the weight of everything on my own." "You've taught me that." Eli felt a warmth spread through him at her words. She had always been the strong one, the one in control. But now she was acknowledging that strength didn't mean doing everything alone. She had learned to trust others, to let them help her, and in doing so, she had become an even more powerful leader. The command deck was quiet for a long moment. The hum of the ship's engines, the only sound filling the room. Eli could feel the weight of everything they had accomplished together, the battles, betrayals, the trust they had built. And for the first time, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what they had achieved. This wasn't just a mission anymore. This was the beginning of something new. "We still have work to do," Alira said, breaking the silence. "The peace talks are still ahead, and there are more challenges waiting for us. But now, I know we're ready. We're stronger than we were before." Eli nodded. He knew she was right. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they had made it this far. They had proven that their alliance could withstand even the toughest trials. The peace talks were still uncertain, but now there was hope. Hope that they could build something better, something lasting. "We'll face whatever comes next," Eli said. "Together." Lyra met his gaze, her eyes steady. "Together." As the days passed, the Valkyrie and the human forces worked side by side to ensure the future of their alliance. The peace talks went smoothly, thanks in no small part to the trust that had been built between them. The galaxy was a dangerous place, filled with threats from every corner, but now humans and Valkyrie stood together, united against the darkness. Alira and Eli found themselves working closely together, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. They still faced challenges, but they faced them as equals, partners in every sense of the word. Alira had learned to trust Eli, and Eli had learned to understand the complexities of the leader he had once viewed as cold and distant. It wasn't just about diplomacy. Any Morit was about something more. It was about finding common ground, about building relationships that went beyond political alliances. It was about trust, respect, and the hope that together they could create something better for the future. One evening, as the stars stretched out before them, Alira and Eli stood together on the observation deck. The vastness of space seemed almost peaceful now, a reminder of how far they had come. The war was over, but the peace they had worked for was just beginning. "I never thought I'd be standing here," Alira said quietly, her voice almost lost in the stillness. "I never thought I'd find a partner, someone I could truly trust." Turned to face her, his heart full. "You've found someone, Alira, and so have I." They stood together, side by side, as the stars above them twinkled with promise. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, they both felt ready for whatever it would bring. They'd fought for their future, and now they would build it together.